Welcome to the TJ Malden Leadership Podcast, where we talk about life, leadership, and the gospel.
Hey, welcome back to the podcast. Glad you have joined us today. Listen, today I want to talk about hurt. We mentioned this in a previous podcast about hurt people. All right, that was the phrase that we used, and that's the phrase that I've heard before, that hurt people. And we use the example, and today it's the example that I want to bring up. Not long ago at an award show, this was everywhere. There were a bunch of memes, and it was all on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, and everywhere you looked, you saw this. Will Smith slapped Chris Rock, right? Chris Rock had made a joke about Will Smith's wife. So Will Smith gets out of his seat, calmly walks to the stage, slaps him across the face, goes back and sits down, and then begins to just scream profanities at Chris Rock. And, everyone, had an opinion about, oh my gosh, what was he thinking? What was he feeling? Did she make him do it? What's going on? And I remember just having this profound sense of awareness when I watched that Will Smith was a dude that was hurting. Like, if you go back in his history, which I grew up watching The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, West Villanova, born and raised on a playground is where I spent. If you're an 80s kid, you grew up in Fresh Prince, and some of those shows were probably important to you as you were growing up. They taught great life lessons. And there's a scene in one of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air episodes where Will Smith asked Uncle Phil, when his dad leaves him, abandons him again for the second time on the show, why doesn't he want me, man? That was the question. And they didn't know why at the moment. It was so, Uncle Phil knocking his hat off and embracing him and him crying. That wasn't a part of the original script. But then you find out that Will Smith's, in real life, his dad had abandoned him, that he had a deep, deep wound from his father. And so as I was watching this award show, I was watching this moment where Will Smith physically hurt this other guy. I couldn't help but think, man, this guy's just wounded. He's broken. Now, does it excuse his behavior? Absolutely not. Should he have been prosecuted for domestic violence? Probably so. Like, he should have. There was assault and battery charge at least, right? There should have been consequences and penalties. And what I want to do today, I don't want to excuse the consequences and the penalties that on a humanistic level should be leveled against people who commit great injustice. But what I want us to realize together is that hurt people, and all of us, every single one of us, carry with us hurts. And most of us interpret the actions and the words of others through hurt that we've experienced in our own lives. Our insecurities, our personalities, our defense mechanisms are often born from, and even most of the personality assessments that you'll look at the origins of, most of them are created and point back to the fundamental hurt that began to form your personality. So everyone carries hurt, and if there's really four things that I want to key in on together, and that's the first one. Everybody carries hurt. Like, this world is fallen and broken. Scripture tells us that all have fallen short of the glory of God, that everyone, literally every single person, is born with this brokenness, right? This disconnect from God, and God is love, and He creates unity and harmony and love and grace. So every single person that's born, we all experience some element of hurt, right? And not only do we interpret the things that are said and done in this life through that hurt, but sometimes we even communicate through that pain. We communicate through past trauma. We communicate through past hurt. And this is a reality. There are times that people in our life who have not hurt us experience hurt from us because we hold things against them that others have done to us. That's a really important point that we should hear today. Everyone carries hurt, and everyone communicates on some level from hurt. But can I just maybe encourage you today? Maybe there's people in your life that you're holding past trauma or past hurt against, and it's the injustice that someone else did to you. It's the hurt that you experienced from someone else. It's the gossip or the lie or the infringement of trust that someone else committed against you, and you're holding that against people in your life that actually haven't wounded you yet. So know that everyone carries hurt, and that you're going to filter and sometimes say things from the foundation of hurt. The second thing that I would say is look through what's being said in hurt. You say, TJ, what in the world are you talking about? There's a moment this became true for me. At our church, we were renovating an old chapel that we have that was built in 1914. And we had like this town hall kind of Q&A for our church to discuss, if they were for it or if they were for it or against it. And this sweet little old lady, she was at the time, I think she's 99 now. She might be over 100. She's still alive. She was maybe 87 somewhere. This was about 7 years ago. So she was at 90. Well, she was right at 90 years old. And she was vehemently opposed to renovating this chapel. Now, the chapel needed to be renovated, right? There was fire hazards. I mean, it just needed to be fixed. But she stood up and she said this, and she had a blue dress on. Her hair was, solid white, but fixed perfect. I remember everything about this moment because God really used it to teach me something. And she stood up and she said, I'm against renovation. I'm against fixing things. I'm against anything we want to do in here. And I thought, man, this is really strange. So she talked for a few more minutes. And then she said this. She said, if you continue with the renovation plans that you have in place now, you're going to change the format, the layout, and you're going to create a center aisle. And you're going to take away the two side aisles. And she said this. She said, my husband, at his funeral, his casket came down the left side aisle and it exited the right side aisle. And she said, and in that moment, this is what I realized. She actually doesn't care about the renovation of the building so much. If you could look through what she was saying in her hurt, we were about to change her last earthly memory and connection of one of her very last memories and connections of her husband. So she wasn't speaking about architectural integrity. She wasn't speaking about the carpet or the brand or what flooring. And she may not have even been aware of this, but she was communicating what she experienced as one of her last major hurts and traumas. She was so if you were to look through what she was saying about a building and facilities, what you realize is she's talking from a deep wound of losing her husband. And so when you begin to look through the smoke screen of arguments that are made in hurt, when you begin to really try to get to the core of why someone's wounded and sometimes why someone wants to argue or why someone is frustrated, what you often find is that it's not even really about you or the situation, but there's usually a deeper wound that's been exacerbated by a smaller issue in the present. And so that's my challenge. One, remember that everyone carries hurt. And the second thing would be look through what's being said. Don't just analyze the words of hurt. When you realize hurt people, sometimes people hurt your feelings because they're scared or they're angry or they're upset or they're fearful. Listen, we just went through we're in the process of going through a transition here at our church. And just this past week, I was voted in as our lead pastor here. And it's a great celebration. And in that process, we took questions I bet we fielded about 120 questions, and there were some statements, and there were some really kind of hateful things said about me and written to me, and even some emails I received. And it was so interesting because someone said, TJ, does that hurt your feelings or does that make you angry? And honestly, it just gave me this deep sense of sadness because of what I realized is like most of the people saying some of these things don't actually know me. So this isn't about me. This is about their fear or wounds that have happened to them or change that they're terrified of. And so when you realize that a lot of the arguments or pushback that you get in your life is the fundamental elements of that is someone else's hurt or their fear or their own anger. It allows you to have more grace towards someone. Now, some people are just unkind, and some people are bitter, and some people are resentful, sure. But what you have to realize is that at the end of the day, and the fourth point is really going to unpack this for us, you have to look through those things to see the person, because every person has a hurt, and every person should have the opportunity to experience Jesus on this planet. And you might be, let me say this, you might be the only Jesus they see. So it's easy to respond with anger when you're met with anger. It's easy to respond with hurt when you're met with hurt. But here would be my challenge, and this is the third one. Don't react. Respond. Slow down and just think. James 1:19-20 in the scripture says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." You say, TJ, what is that talking about? Well, slow down. Like, take a moment to think. We want to respond, right? We want to get someone back quick. My wife tells me, and by the grace of God, I've grown in this, but my wife, when we used to argue, especially early on in our marriage, she would say, TJ, you always go for the jugular. Like, you never fight fair. Like, you always want to comment back and just shut down the argument. And listen, that was true. And what we realized through our marriage and good, wise counsel in our marriage is that I was raised in a home where everybody yelled at each other. I've lived through, between my mom and my dad and their relationships, I've lived through 10 different marriages. And so I watched a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, and a lot of hurt. And so when I entered my marriage, I didn't know how to be patient or kind or soft-spoken or grace-filled. So I just did what I'd always seen. And that's not good. If you want to have your marriage, you want a good life, like you've really got to work on not reacting, responding. All I'd ever seen was reaction. I had never seen a response, like a slowed down, tempered, mature response. And so that's something that I had to really work at and cultivate in our home and in our marriage. My wife is super patient. She's super kind. She's incredibly forgiving. And I can be mean at times. And, I'm quick tempered and those things. And the Lord has had to really work on, like, that's one big element, not just in my relationship with my wife, but in my life. Like, I've had to really work on slowing down and responding rather than just reacting. It's very easy for me to react. So that verse, the reason that verse is meaningful to me is because, that's the encouragement, right? You want to be slow to speak. You want to be quick to listen. You want to be slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Well, what does that second part of that verse mean? Check this out. Think of a time in your life where anger gave birth to something beautiful. Like your anger, your resentment, your bitterness, your frustration, your gossip, right? Which is just an overflow of hurt. Like think of it with me. I can't think of a time in my life where I gave in to unhealthy feelings of anger. Now, there's righteous anger. There's no doubt. Should we be angry about injustice in the world? Absolutely. Should we rally around and serve the most vulnerable? Absolutely. There's a righteous anger. But I'm talking about relational anger, right? Unjustified, hurtful anger, right? Hurtful resentment, hurtful gossip. Has there ever been a moment in your life where you can look back and say, oh, you know what? Like that bitterness that I carried for so long really produced a lot of peace in my life. That anger that I carried for so long really, really fleshed itself out and gave birth to all this beauty. No, right? Because the anger in our hearts does not produce the righteousness that God desires. The way that I would say, the way that it makes sense for me when I read that verse is like when we give in to reacting, we usually give birth to more hurt. When we slow down and we respond, we can cultivate a healthy future and we can begin to build something beautiful. I said this a few weeks ago when we had a conversation about Roe v. Wade and all there's I mean, you've seen it in the news. There's so much anger. There's been anger and nastiness on both sides of the issue, right? The pro-choice and the pro-life side. There's been anger on both sides. There's been nastiness, even from people who would call themselves Christians, right? There was this unkindness. And I look back at the issue and I'm like, man, when we slow down and we begin to respond to one another and have the conversation, we can disagree and we can move through hurts together, communicating our values, communicating what we believe to be true from Scripture and in our lives, but at the end of the day, beginning to build bridges to a healthy life rather than just blowing up in anger and blowing up in resentment. I've never experienced it, and I challenge you to evaluate your own life. I've never experienced a moment where anger, resentment, hatred, unkindness has ever given birth to something beautiful. All right? The last thing, and you say, well, TJ, how do I deal with like when I experience anger or when when someone hurts me, and I will say this, I do want you to hear me this. If it's abuse or neglect, call the police, okay? Like from the jump, I want you to hear that. Like, I'm not advocating that you endure abuse or neglect anyone. But if it's relational hurt, right? If it's anger, if it's resentment, if it's bitterness, if it's something on that level, my desire in my life, and I hope it could be yours, is that you would work to be unoffendable. I say this all the time on staff together here, but we work and we want to lean into having thick skin and soft hearts. So that when someone says a word in anger, someone says a word in resentment or bitterness or whatever, we're not overly offended or instantly offended. Rather, we have thick skin, and we have a soft heart so that we can still love the person. We can still shepherd the person out of their hurt into healing. Because that's where you want to be ultimately. You don't want to be over. We live in a culture that everybody is offended about everything all the time, right? Like everybody's offended about everything. And I mean, we need to cultivate. I'm a believer in Jesus, and you may not be if you're listening, but and even if you're not, you should work. You should want to work to be unoffendable, right? You want to have thick skin and a soft heart. You want to be able to endure this life and to experience joy. And I mean, my prayer for you is that you would see the goodness of Jesus eventually if you don't know him, but you want to work to be unoffendable and have thick skin and a soft heart. The last two things I want to tell you, if you were to pin me down and say, TJ, all right, like give me two things. If I'm dealing with hurt, if I'm really struggling with hurt, and maybe you're held captive by some hurts in your life, say, TJ, what can I do? And maybe you're like me. Like I realized that my hurt from my childhood, I was responding early on in my marriage. This is 11 years ago. I was responding early on because of hurt I experienced. And after experiencing these two things I'm about to give you, I found healing. And in that, my marriage found healing. My friendships found healing. And I'm not perfect by any means, but these two things are the two things, if you were to pin me down, that I've always circled back to, that have allowed me and my friend group, people that I've seen, not just myself experienced, but other people have experienced, that brought them healing so that they could stop the cycle of hurt. Because hurt people, check this out, until they don't. Hurt people until they don't. There can be, and I believe this, there can be a moment in your life, in the generational impacts of your family. Anger is something that was perpetuated in my family from generation to generation to generation. But because of these two things I'm about to tell you, anger is something that I decided 11 years ago was not going to control me or my family or impact my marriage. These two things, they're really simple, but they're paramount. The first one, take it to Jesus. Matthew 11:28 says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Like Jesus, and this is one of the things I love about Jesus. I love a lot of things about Jesus. You hear me talk about him all the time. But I love that he wants us to bring him our burdens. He wants us to bring him our brokenness. He doesn't reject us in our anger and our frustration or bitterness, any of the hurts that you may bring. Jesus doesn't reject you. They aren't too much for him. He wants them, and he wants to carry them for you. So number one would be take it to Jesus. because he's going to be there when other people can't be. The second thing is this: take it to a counselor. I cannot say this enough. There is no shame in getting counseling for your hurts, right? I know for a long time there was this, the stigma of, you can't go to counseling. If you go to counseling, keep it hush hush and yada yada. Everything's got to be, perfect, especially in the church. Listen, that is a lie from hell that we have to tear down brick by brick. Go see a counselor. Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. Proverbs 11:14 says, where there is no guidance, a people fall, but in the abundance of counselors, there is safety. Like, there's this biblical mandate and this biblical encouragement for us to go talk to somebody. So go. Like, you're struggling with hurt, and it may be hurt that nobody in your life right now, you may be married for years, or you may be parenting, and there's hurts that you've tucked away that you don't even, you know they're there, and you think on them and you contemplate them and you know they affect you, but you don't want to unearth them, or you don't want to deal with them. Listen, please, please, please take it to Jesus and go see a counselor. Go talk to someone that can help you put them in the boxes to be dealt with that they need to be dealt with. And there have been moments in my life. There were things that happened in my childhood, and I'll be vulnerable. There were things that happened in my childhood. There was attempted abuse in my life, physical and sexual abuse on me. And when I was a kid, when I was 8 to 10 years old, and for a long time, I just thought, you know what? We're going to hide this. We're not going to talk about this. I'm never going to share this. And I didn't realize that those things that happened to me informed, or even the things that were attempted on me, were beginning to form some of my anger, some of my frustration, even some of my dating habits and the way that I treated females and the way that I treated relationships early on in my life. I look back and think, man, if I could have just sat down with someone and dumped all of this out, and someone else wiser and, someone more wise and more kind and smarter than me could have helped me dig through some of this early on, rather than having to go back and dig it all up in my 20s and then again in my early 30s. So listen, I sit in a seat today that I'm telling you, I'm not saying, hey, do this, I think it'll be good. I've been there. I've walked that road, and I'm telling you that counseling, taking it to Jesus and taking it to wise counsel, good counselors, is the best thing that you could ever do. If you were to pin me down and say, TJ, what are the 2 things that I need to do? And I know this podcast, you may say, man, we started and I just thought this was going to be light and breezy. This got kind of heavy and deep. Listen, I'm not here just for the light and fun. I want you to grow, and I want to grow through this. I want you to get help if you need to get help, and I want you to be encouraged. Okay, so listen, dig in. Find a counselor, reach out to me, email our podcast. We would love to set you up with a biblical counselor, and we would love to help you talk to Jesus if you've never done that. So know this, remember this, and this is how we're going to close today. Hurt people until they don't. You have the power to stop the cycle. We love you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the TJ Malden Leadership Podcast, where we talk about life, leadership, and the gospel. If you enjoyed this episode, share with a friend. For more content, follow us on Instagram and YouTube. If you have any questions you would like to ask TJ, whether it is about life, leadership, or the gospel, you can email those to tjmaldenleadershippodcast@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening, and we hope you join us again on the TJ Malden Leadership Podcast.